I told myself I was only looking because the blinds were already open. Her kitchen faced my living room at a diagonal across the courtyard, and in summer the evening light traveled a neat path between our windows, laying itself across countertops and sofa arms like a quiet visitor. My neighbor, Elise, watered herbs on her sill at dusk, tapping the clay pots to loosen roots, flicking water from her fingers like she was shaking off a dream. I knew these things because the courtyard made them common knowledge, and because I convinced myself that noticing wasn't the same as watching. It started with easy rituals: her kettle's soft clatter, the sweep of a dish towel, a book balanced one-handed as she leaned against the counter. She worked late some nights and arrived home with her hair in a loose knot and a tote bag that never seemed to sit still on her shoulder. On weekends, she dragged a chair to the balcony and read with her knees drawn up, as if keeping company with herself required a particular geometry. She never looked over for long. When she did, her gaze skipped off like light skimming a lake. I never waved. I wasn't that kind of neighbor. Or maybe I just wasn't sure what kind that made me. We'd exchanged exactly 3 conversations before all this. The first when I signed the lease. 3rd floor? No elevator? Brave, she said with a wry smile. The second when a package went to her by mistake. And the third when the building lost power and we took turns on the landing holding our phones like lanterns. Each time she felt both near and off limits, like a book in a language I could sound out but not understand yet. 30-something? Maybe early 40s? The kind of composed that made silence feel chosen, not accidental. I was 23 and pretending my unfinished degree was a detour rather than a stalled engine. The night it shifted, thunderclouds hung somewhere beyond the rooftops, rumbling without commitment. I was scraping a pan clean with the back of a wooden spoon, a playlist humming low, the window ajar for air. Across the courtyard her lights came on one by one: entry, kitchen, lamp by the bookshelf. She moved through them like a sequence, shedding the day, and when she paused by the sink to tie her hair again, something about the smallness of the gesture, the tilt of her head, the way her elbows made brief sharp wings, caught me off guard. I looked too long. Long enough to know I looked too long. She turned. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden music, no dropped glass. Just her face finding mine across that miniature distance, the nearly mirror of our windows making it feel like we stood on opposite sides of the same room. My breath snagged. I told myself the reflection might hide me, that if the angle did me any favors, it might be plausible I was considering the weather or the neighbor's cat on the fence. But my eyes had already said more than that, and we both knew. She didn't flinch, didn't frown. Something unreadable traveled across her mouth, the hint of a smile that wasn't exactly one. The kettle began to sing behind her. She let it, waited a heartbeat longer with her gaze level and steady, then reached to switch it off without breaking eye contact. The sound cut. The quiet between our panes thickened. I stepped back a fraction. She didn't. Maybe that should have ended it, the mutual acknowledgement, the polite retreat, the agreement to resume the fiction that apartments are islands. But later, when I took my mug to the sofa and opened a book I didn't read, I felt her presence like a new piece of furniture, unmissable even with my eyes closed. Somewhere on her side a chair scraped. Somewhere on mine the refrigerator hummed as if it had opinions. I told myself to stop thinking. The night told me it had time. Around 10 the thunder finally committed, a soft spill of rain beginning to tie the courtyard together. I stood, restless, and drifted back to the window. Her curtain was drawn halfway now, but through the gap I could see her curl on the end of her couch, book balanced face down on her thigh. She turned her head like she'd heard something that wasn't there, like a thought had knocked. Then she looked over, not searching, just arriving, her gaze landing where mine would be if I were foolish enough to still be standing. We stayed like that, 2 silhouettes acknowledging a bridge that hadn't existed that morning, until the rain found its rhythm and the room around me remembered to be a room again. I turned out my lamp first, not because I wanted to end it, but because the moment seemed to ask for a border. She reached for her own switch a second later, and for a beat our dark windows held each other like hands. When I lay down, the sound of rain made the ceiling closer. I told myself I'd imagined the steadiness of her look, that all I'd done was notice, that noticing wasn't dangerous. Lightning mapped the windows white, then unmapped them, and somewhere in that brief flicker I replayed the turn of her head, the way she'd waited the length of the kettle's call without blinking. Sleep came late, bringing with it a pretense of forgetting I didn't believe. By morning the courtyard smelled rinsed and temporary. I pretended to search for my keys longer than necessary before leaving for work, just in case the timing placed us at our doors at once. Didn't. Her mat was damp with footprints that weren't hers. At the mailbox I fumbled the combination, then laughed at myself out loud like that might dilute whatever this had become. Didn't. The echo in the stairwell brought her voice back anyway, something she'd said weeks ago in the humid dark, phone light held high. You get used to the building speaking. I wondered if some buildings learned our language faster than we learned theirs. I returned that evening with takeout and the ordinary intention to be ordinary. The window was open. The courtyard waited. I pressed play on the same playlist, turned it down lower than usual, and told myself that what had happened was nothing at all. Then I caught a motion at the edge of my eye, the smallest, her blinds lifting another inch, as if a decision had been made out of sight and was now being allowed to exist. I didn't look, not right away, but I could feel it. Something tuned, something listening. And when I finally lifted my head, the line between our rooms felt less like glass and more like a sentence neither of us had finished yet. 2 days passed and the building composed a new routine around us. I started hearing the hinge of her balcony door the way I used to notice garbage trucks and distant sirens. She began leaving a lamp lit later than before, the warm kind of light that lives closer to skin than to furniture. We ran into each other in the stairwell twice, which was probably 3 times more often than mathematically likely. Each time we paused in a pocket of air that felt like it had waited for us to arrive. The first time, she was coming down with a canvas bag and a head full of rain-cleaned hair, the faint scent of something herbal trailing as if the apartment had insisted on accompanying her. "Mailroom jammed again?" she asked, nodding at the key held stupidly in my hand. "Seems like it," I said. "I think it eats circulars for sport." She smiled at that, not with her mouth so much as with her attention. "We're all just providing it enrichment, then." Her shoulder brushed mine as she slipped past. The contact was nothing and everything, like the moment a song you know by heart reveals an instrument you'd never heard until now. The second time, she was on the landing, thumb on a jar lid that refused to budge. I offered a half joke about specifications, took the jar, broke the seal with too much relief. She thanked me in a murmur that belonged to kitchens and late nights, not to stairwells. I thought of handing the jar back and letting the moment close around it. Instead, I held her gaze a beat too long again. The beat held me back. We accreted micro-conversations. She asked if the thunder woke me. I pointed out the feral cat's new post on the brick wall. She said she was learning to cook one dish properly rather than 10 poorly, and that it took a kind of patience she hadn't practiced in years. I admitted I'd been practicing patience in places that didn't always merit it. We left it there, the kind of leaving that's really storing. I told myself I wasn't looking as much. I was changed what looking meant. Her daily gestures kept auditioning as messages. The way she paused by the window with her tea, the way she drew the blind a breath slower than strictly necessary, the way she set a book down with her finger marking a page like a flag. Was she speaking or was I translating on purpose? On a Saturday, I came back with groceries I didn't need and walked too softly down the hall. Her door was open a polite 3 inches while she wrestled a potted plant onto a tray, fingertips dirt-smudged. The smell of soil, watered moments before, thickened the air with its small gravity. "You look like you have opinions about basil," I said, "because sometimes you throw a rope even if you're not sure where it will catch." "Mostly that it doesn't like me back," she said. "But I keep flattering it anyway." She stepped aside as if the hall belonged to both of us now. "If you're going past the hardware store later, would you mind grabbing 2 of those clay saucers? I can leave cash." "I'm going now," I lied. "No need." She studied me, not suspiciously, not kindly either, accurately, which is worse. "You don't have to make a trip for my basil." "I don't," I said. "But I might." Her mouth made that almost smile again, a private punctuation. She tipped her head toward the half-open window, where the courtyard offered its predictable perfume of stone warming and cooling. "It's good light at this hour," she said. "You noticed that?" "I notice a lot of things I didn't used to," I said before I could file the sentence for approval. She didn't look away. "Do you?" Could have ended with the hardware store. Didn't. I returned with saucers and the accidental confidence of someone carrying props. She was seated on the floor when she opened the door, knees up, hair catching the light at 2 or 3 uncooperative strands. I handed her the bag and said something about diameters, which may have been about something else. She reached into the bag and brushed my fingers with the back of her knuckles. Not an accident unless accidents had begun to learn choreography. "You could ask," she said then softly, like a reminder to drink water, "if you're curious." For a second the hall narrowed to the 4 inches between us. The building's quiet pressed nearer, all its minor mechanisms becoming witnesses. My mind performed a dozen useless errands at once. Find a safe joke, bow out gracefully, change the subject, return to the basil. None of those errands were the errand being asked of me. Ask what? I managed, the words more air than sense. Whatever she'd expected, it wasn't that. Or maybe it was, and that was the point. The almost smile sharpened into something precise. "You'll know when you do." Then she stood, set the saucers on the mat, and stepped back into her apartment, the door easing toward the frame without quite closing. An open parenthesis waiting for its pair. The hallway's hum resumed. My heart did not. I stood there long enough to become absurd, then joined the rest of the building in pretending. That night, I didn't open my blinds right away. I paced. I rearranged the 3 books on my coffee table as though order could disguise impulse. When I finally lifted the slats, the courtyard had gathered its usual grammar of light and breeze. Her lamp was on, low, the chair by her shelf occupied by a blanket instead of her. I told myself to be patient with the language. Across the way her shadow passed, paused, turned, listening the way I was listening. I set my phone face down and let the room quiet around the place in me that had tilted. The text came at 9:14, a number I'll probably remember long after I forget why. "Elise, if you still have that spare screwdriver, I could use a hand with a stubborn hinge." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't not one. I stared at the screen long enough to feel ridiculous, then typed sure and deleted 3 alternate versions that said too much or too little. I put on shoes as if the trip across the hall required weather. At her door the hinge really did complain, a thin metallic throat clear. The plant sat smug on its new saucer. She stepped aside to let me in, a gesture so ordinary it felt ceremonial. Inside smelled like citrus and books. On the table, the hinge, the screws in a neat small galaxy, the screwdriver I'd give to most neighbors and to no one else. "Thank you," she said. "For the hinge," I said. "I meant something else." While I worked, she leaned against the counter with a glass of water, watching, not staring, offering the exact amount of attention that makes a person more careful than their hands would otherwise be. "I meant what I said," she offered after a while, conversational and not about asking. I tightened a screw too far, reversed it, and let the silence be honest. I don't want to misunderstand the question, I said, which was a way of admitting I already understood the answer. Her glass paused halfway to the counter. That's a considerate way to be curious. She set the glass down. The hinge sat obedient now, as if it wanted to leave us without excuses. You could start smaller, she said. What do you want to know right now? I could have said, what changed? I could have said, when did you start hearing the building speak my name? I could have said, are we reckless or simply awake? Instead I said, whether the basil forgave you. She laughed then, caught and surprised, the laugh of someone who had invited a charge and gotten a mercy. It might. I won't push my luck. Her phone lit on the table with a name she didn't choose to read. The room returned to its full size. Thank you, she said again, and this time it was for something that didn't involve hardware. I left with the screwdriver still in her drawer. Sunday carried the kind of quiet that makes sound travel differently, as if anything said in a room might find its way under doors and along baseboards, down the hall to someone unprepared. I spent the morning pretending to clean and the afternoon trying not to rearrange my expectations into boxes they didn't fit. By evening, the courtyard light had found its lower angle, that brief hour when everything takes itself less seriously before handing the night its coat. At 6:03 she knocked, a spare rhythm, confident without being loud. I opened the door with the peculiar certainty of someone who has already guessed the pretext. Can you help me carry something? She asked, palm braced to keep the door from drifting farther open as if to say, this is practical, this is easy, this is both. Her place had been folded into a kind of sundae, records stacked without sleeves, a sweater draped over the chair like a person who'd stepped out and left their posture behind. It's only awkward, not heavy, she said, pointing toward a box by the bookshelf. Photographs, if the slippery corners were any indication. Albums, if the weight belonged to paper. I kept meaning to move them, but you know how meaning behaves. We lifted one side each and navigated to the hall closet. The box could have managed without both of us, but togetherness made a grammar no single sentence could. When we set it down, we didn't step back fast. Proximity does that, decides on your behalf. My sleeve brushed her wrist. The building made one of its small internal sounds, water traveling somewhere like a private rumor. Thank you, she said, heartbeat length closer than thank yous generally require. You're welcome, I said, which didn't cover it. She went to the kitchen, rinsed her hands under the tap, dried them with a towel whose cotton had survived more afternoons than some friendships. Stay for tea, she said, as if staying were already the thing I was doing. Or don't, if you have plans that will improve you more than I will. I have unambitious plans, I said. Tea outranks them. While the kettle built its case, she took 2 cups from the cabinet. A matched pair, the way pairs are in houses where someone has decided what belongs with what. I want to be clear, she said, as if picking up a conversation we hadn't paused. I don't collect misunderstandings. I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. I'm not auditioning for a role I didn't want last year. I don't have a last year to compare to, I said. Just this week and the way the courtyard feels like it knows about us. That's new, she admitted. The courtyard's nosy. A curl had fallen from the knot in her hair. She tucked it back with a gesture that belonged to kitchens at dusk across countries. What I meant the other day about asking wasn't a dare. What was it? Permission, she said. Then, after a beat, and maybe a way to keep us honest. Steam fogged the kettle spout. The room retreated into the kind of quiet that makes a person aware of where their hands are. She poured, slid a cup toward me on the counter, and half smiled at its final inch of travel as if pleased by the physics of small offerings. I wrapped my fingers around the heat and searched for the version of the truth that would stand up in this light. "What are you afraid I'll ask?" I said. "That I'll have to answer with a version of myself I'm not trying to be anymore." She met my eyes without flinching. "Or that I'll want to." We took the tea to the small table. Our chairs arranged themselves into a map. Not across, not beside, but at an angle that made the distance negotiable. Outside, a neighbor laughed on a phone, half of a conversation punctuating the evening like a metronome that missed every other beat. Inside, I practiced not looking away first. "Tell me something true," she said. "Not performatively true. Just capacity of a cup true. I'm tired of holding my breath in rooms that don't ask me to," I said. "And I don't know how to stop unless someone else breathes like I do." "That's good," she said, and I tried not to need the approval in it. "I don't like breath held for me." "I was also going to ask about your basil again," I added, because mercy has a role even in precision. "It died heroically," she said gravely, and we let the laugh that followed soften what it needed to without erasing it. We talked about unremarkable things with the kind of care that makes them remarkable. The record player's quirk, the neighbor with the bicycle who breaks the stair rule and then apologizes in cookies, the way first rain after heat makes the city smell like coins. The conversation had edges we both acknowledged by choosing not to lean on them. Every so often she'd glance at the window as if checking the courtyard's attendance, then back to me as if confirming we were still alone enough to mean what we meant. At some point our cups were empty and neither of us moved to stand. She studied the lines inside her cup like a patient superstition. "Do you want to ask something?" she said, neutral tone, sincere posture. "Or do you want to not ask yet and know that I'll still be here the next time you think you prefer courage?" I felt the question open a door in me with a sound like the hinge I'd tightened. I didn't trust the first thing my mouth would do if given permission to leap. So I matched her tone, kept the room at its chosen temperature, and said, "I want to ask if this is just about a week of weather and proximity, or if the building had been speaking to you before I learned its language." "It had," she said, quietly, in footnotes. She held my gaze and didn't let it become a stare. "And no, it's not just weather." "Okay," I said, not because I was finished, but because sometimes okay is the only bridge word sturdy enough to reach the next shore. She stood then, not to end anything, but to place her cup in the sink, a small ceremony that returned us to our bodies. "One more true thing," she said with her back turned, hands under cool water. "And then you can have the mercy of an exit." "I felt seen the first time we held our phones up for the power outage," I said. "And I pretended I didn't." She turned, towel in hand. "I did too." The towel stilled. "Ask me something that requires a yes or no." "Do you want me to stay longer tonight?" I said, and even inside the politeness of the phrasing, I knew the question's gravity. "Yes," she said. Then, immediately, "But ask me again tomorrow and make sure I still mean it." We didn't move closer. We didn't test the hinges of other doors. We sat down again in the same chairs and let the room feel our answer instead. When I eventually stood, it was because the building had returned from witness to host, and the night outside had grown generous with its hours. At her door she said, "Thank you for asking." I said, "Thank you for answering." Both of us understood those words weren't parting gifts so much as the wrapping paper we needed to remove slowly next time. The corridor smelled faintly of mint and paper, and the sleep other apartments were rehearsing. I carried the quiet back across the hall like something that could be spilled. The next day behaved like any other day that knows it isn't. Emails stacked themselves and unstacked themselves with the same hollow theater. A bus sighed at a stop as if it had opinions about our private lives. The sky performed indecision and called it weather. I moved through it all with the mild astonishment of someone who'd remembered a word that had been under his tongue for years. At lunch, I nearly texted her nothing a dozen ways. By late afternoon, I read an entire page 3 times and kept none of it. When evening arrived, it did so with the precise pace of a metronome set to "Don't You Dare Rush." I prepared dinner like a rehearsal, then let it go cold. Somewhere in there I understood that what I wanted to ask had already been partly answered, and that the next worthy thing was to behave as if I trusted the answer. At 7:12 I knocked, the same spare rhythm she'd used. Confidence gently announced, not demanded. She opened the door with a look that made me grateful for patience in languages I hadn't thought to study. "Hi," she said, as if hi had always been this kind of word. I wanted to risk another question. I said, "Good," she said, stepping aside. Her palm again a practiced parenthesis. I kept the kettle half full. The apartment wore a different quiet, not heavier or lighter, just more articulate. I took the same chair at the same angle because rules, once chosen together, can be a kind of relief. She poured without asking what, and the cup found its place under my hand like a familiar argument forgiven. "Ask?" she said, not unkindly, not eagerly, simply, like breathing. "Do you want this to stay a room we make together?" I said. "Or a room we let the building make of us?" She considered, and in the considering I saw the person who had left lamplight on as a declaration, the person who had drawn a blind slow enough to teach a language, the person who had turned a hinge into a question and a question into permission. "A room we make," she said, "given that we know it will move when we do." "That's the answer I wanted," I said, not because I'd have left otherwise, but because wanting and receiving can be 2 different doors to the same hallway. We let the talk touch ordinary things again so it wouldn't collapse under the weight of being only one kind of talk. She asked about work, and I told the truth without dramatizing my dissatisfaction. I asked about a photograph on her shelf, and she told me the story as if she trusted me not to edit its messy middle. Every so often our hands found adjacency on the table and didn't flinch. We had discovered a calibration scale. The exact distance that felt honest, the exact silence that carried us forward. At one point, she reached for a book and set it between us like a shared object requires witnesses. "I used to think I was done with beginnings," she said. "Then I remembered beginnings don't ask your permission. I used to think curiosity was a thing you apologized for," I said. "Then you told me to ask." We both smiled, not at each other, but at the same idea from 2 sides. When the kettle cooled and the room did that thing rooms do, resuming their ordinary posture as if to usher us toward an hour we could carry without spilling. We didn't reach for dramatic gestures to insist on what we already knew. We let our fingers find each other, the way the blind finds the cord it's trained to hold. We didn't investigate what holding might lead to. We simply allowed the truth of contact to speak for us. "If you need me to draw a line," she said quietly, a kindness with edges, "I can. I won't draw it in chalk." "I need us to draw it together," I said, "and to know we can move it when we mean to. Then we will." She held my hand with the exact pressure a promise requires. Outside, the courtyard offered its modest weather report in leaves and brick and the sound of someone testing a laugh on a phone. Inside, we built a small vocabulary of ordinary assurances. "I'll text before I knock. We will keep our windows as witnesses and not spectators. If either of us says stop, we will turn every hinge in the room to the same direction." It wasn't a contract. It was better. When I stood to go, it was not to leave the moment but to mark it. At the door, I didn't ask for permission to look back. The room had already granted that as a right. She leaned against the frame, a brief mirror of the first night. I'd noticed the smallness of her gestures and the vastness of their consequences. "Ask me something tomorrow," she said, a ritual disguised as instruction. "I will," I said, felt like saying grace. In my apartment, the air recognized me with the faint embarrassment of a friend who has heard you sing to yourself. I closed my own door softly, turned off my lamp, and let the courtyard compose the space between us like a sentence finally confident in its grammar. When I lifted my blinds a fraction before sleep, her lamp was already dimmed to a prayer of light. She didn't look over. She didn't need to. The windows held hands again. Not a secret, not a spectacle. Two panes keeping weather honest while the people behind them practiced the future tense. I lay down and didn't hold my breath.